It was tense in Tel Aviv on May the 14th, 1948. It was a day of which all future Jewish generations would never cease to speak and dream, the day of Israel's birth. Many leaders of Palestine Jewry had been hesitant about proclaiming independence. Some feared that such a spectacular act might provoke war with uncertain consequence, but Ben-Gurion convened the leaders who decided by 6 against 4 to declare independence, come what may.
In a last-minute plea to avert war, Golda Meir met with King Abdullah of Transjordan, who turned her down, warning that he will join Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon in their invasion if a Jewish state is proclaimed.
David Ben-Gurion made an energetic entry and declaimed the proclamation on the rise of Israel in a firm and confident voice. There was a sense of high occasion. The applause was fervent. In the modern history of Israel, we've lived a kind of a process of fluctuation, passing from a mood of celebration to moods of deep anxiety. We established our independence by the declaration of the 14th of May, 1948. But before our celebrations had died down, before the noise of festivities had subsided, there was a bombing of Israel the next morning by Egypt, and Arab forces began to converge upon us. The Arab aim was the extinction of Israel. They would mock the very idea that a Jewish state could arise against the Arab will. Israel, less than 1 day old, was being attacked not by untrained volunteers, but by the armies of 6 sovereign Arab states, well-trained and lavishly equipped with British and French weaponry. The combined Arab armies had 35,000 men with modern armor and artillery.
The Jewish army, men, women, and high school students who face the Arab onslaught are mainly civilians, poorly equipped, barely trained, using faith and determination against overwhelming odds.
Our forces were now engaged on 3 fronts: in the north against the Syrians and Lebanese, in the center against the Iraqi army and the Transjordanian Arab Legion, and in the south against the formidable Egyptians. But Jerusalem was our greatest source of danger. On May the 18th, the Arab Legion had launched its assault on Jerusalem. It penetrated the old city, a knife thrust at Israel's heart. The fighting was house to house and hand to hand.
When the state was declared, I was not on the convoy. I commanded a brigade that fought in the besieged Jerusalem. It was a very bitter fighting. The brigade that I commanded suffered the highest number of casualties than any one of the other 12 brigades of the armed forces of Israel, of the IDF. I didn't think about the meaning of the state. I was completely preoccupied in the fighting in the besieged Jerusalem to prevent the annihilation of 80,000 Jews that were under the siege, thirsty for water, starving for food, shelled, fired at by snipers. This was what I thought about, not what would happen with the state later on. Then we fought for our survival in the real meaning of the word.
The teenagers between the ages of 12 and 14 were recruited to the Gadna, to the paramilitary service, and they performed functions of messengers, carrying notes, carrying ammunition. Some of them were hurt, were wounded, severely wounded. One of them lost his leg. They not only showed the bravery, they were actually better functioning than any grown-up could do.
On May the 28th, in Jerusalem, with only 300 rounds of ammunition left and only 36 fighting men still in action, the defenders of the old city had to surrender. Arabs looted the Jewish quarter, destroying dozens of synagogues in their wild rampage. Fewer than 1,200 civilians made their sad, weary way down the slopes of Mount Zion. Their wounds were tended. West Jerusalem fought on with valor against the Arab Legion, whose morale was now high. Its Jewish population was besieged, threatened with famine and thirst, isolated from the main body of the state, and subjected to an inferno of bombardment day and night. When Jerusalem was under siege, we had reached a point which one of our commanders at that time, General Herzog, has portrayed.
Its water supplies had been cut off, and it was living only on what had been collected in the water cisterns. Everybody was living on 1 pail of water a day for all purposes, and about 3 slices of bread a day. That's all that was left in the city at the time.
It would be impossible to bring water, food, or ammunition into Jerusalem unless the heights commanding the approaches to the city from the coast could be captured by the Palmach troops. The Palmach attacked Kastel across seemingly impassable hills and rocks. Ben-Gurion was implacable in demanding this costly effort. It was decided to try to seize Latrun, formerly a British police stronghold where the Arab Legion was entrenched.
We were thrown into battle at Latrun in order to try to open the road to Jerusalem. Even though the forces in which I personally participated, such as the 7th Brigade, were not ready to go into battle. They had not been trained, they didn't know each other. Some of them had just come off the boats as immigrants from Cyprus. I don't know if they really knew how to handle a rifle or not.
These untrained troops were thrown into the inferno, attacking, retreating, attacking again and again. Despite their gallantry in carrying out a difficult order, they failed to break through. After the fall of the old city, Israel had to absorb another defeat.
We didn't succeed. Ben-Gurion was very heavily criticized for this decision.
For while Jerusalem was our main anxiety, we were heavily engaged in resisting dangerous enemy pressures in the north and in the south. In the north, the focus of our disquiet was Degania, known as the mother of the kibbutz movement, founded in 1910. It was a powerful symbol for all Israelis. The Syrians had attacked at dawn on May the 20th with heavy artillery fire. Syrian tanks broke through Degania's defenses and were set afire by Molotov cocktails thrown by the kibbutzniks at short range.
For 4 days, the farmers of Kibbutz Degania thwart repeated Syrian armored attacks, destroy tanks using Molotov cocktails, and hold the northern front.
While Degania and Jerusalem were in deadly hazard, there was a third point of peril in the south. The Egyptians were advancing relentlessly along the coast. Their proximity to Tel Aviv was alarming. On May the 19th, the Egyptian army had reached the tiny kibbutz of Yad Mordechai. It was reluctantly decided to remove the women and children to safety. There were 4 separate assaults by the Egyptians in a single day. The Arab aim was the extinction of Israel.
In his first speech in the Security Council, Abba Eban asserts Israel's independence.
If the Arab states want peace with Israel, they can have it. If they want war, they can have that too. But whether they want peace or war, they can have it only with the independent, sovereign state of Israel. By May the 23rd, the defenders were running short of ammunition. They couldn't hold out. In the dawn of May the 24th, the survivors of Yad Mordechai left their ruined village.
Because of the bravery of the settlers on the way, who did not evacuate, the Egyptians advanced very hesitantly. The Egyptians advanced nevertheless, and they reached the area of Isdud, which is today the site of the town of Ashdod. The Givati Brigade, which played a major part in blocking the Egyptian army, moved into action.
In the early part of June, our forces had been made breathless by the sheer ferocity of their battles. I received a rare phone call from Ben-Gurion. I hope to get a Security Council meeting in a few days. The Prime Minister said gravely, "Not quick enough. It is a matter of hours."
A promise of peace for at least 4 weeks comes to the Holy Land. Jews and Arabs reach a truce that could restore embattled Jerusalem as a free place of worship for 3 faiths.
The only hope of rescuing West Jerusalem from starvation was by building a road at breakneck speed through ostensibly impassable Judean hills. But what we needed more than anything else was a respite in which we could regroup and train and refresh our weary troops. The truce was to come into force on June the 14th. United Nations observers were to see that no movement to anyone's advantage would occur once the truce was in effect. For 3 days, we strove to bring the New Jerusalem Road to completion. It was a desperate race against time. With 1 hour left, the race was won.
First free convoy to Jerusalem. Climbing up to Jerusalem early in the morning. We were soldiers and we kissed each other, we hugged each other. It was almost a bless of God.
On the first trucks in that first convoy that broke through, there was a Hebrew inscription, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its cunning."
This was an unbelievable saga of heroism. I don't think that people can even envisage what happened in a completely hopeless situation in which sheer guts combined with leadership and are willing to make the supreme sacrifice by everybody, without exception, finally won the day.
There was now a respite, time to honor the dead and to thank the fighting men. The United Nations Security Council had performed a great benefit in enforcing the truce. The truce gave our forces an opportunity to regain strength. Rest and exercise fashioned a more efficient army, trained to the sharpest edge. At the same time, copious quantities of ammunition and equipment were brought in, chiefly from Czechoslovakia. New branches of the service, such as paratroopers, were inaugurated. An air force was born. In the winter of 1948 and 1949, the camps in Cyprus where the British had held thousands of immigrants were emptied, and the internees were finally brought home. Ships from all over the world could now freely carry anyone who wished to join us in the nation's defense. Foreign volunteers under the name of Machal flocked to us from all over the world. Some of the more cherished volunteers had flying experience with the British Royal Air Force. The birth of the Israeli Air Force during this struggle for survival was attended by irony.
Cynically as history can be sometimes, we fought for the creation of the Jewish state after 2,000 years in the German Messerschmitt 109, chasing British-built Spitfires flown by the Egyptian Air Force mainly, So we got German-built airplanes from the communists to fight against British-built Spitfires. I took part in one very nice dogfight with the RAF. My belly was going upside down when I saw so many Egyptians so near to Tel Aviv, where I was born.
A modest naval component was assembled at Haifa and manned by sailors who had seen service in somewhat more formidable fleets.
The beach at Tel Aviv becomes a battlefield. In the first serious breach in the new Israeli nation, Irgun extremists clash with the government over a shipload of ammunition. As United Nations observers look on, Irgunists try to unload the American-made LST on the beach. But rather than permit violation of the UN-imposed truce between Jew and Arab, Israeli soldiers fire on the ship and its much-needed cargo. Brother fights brother in the confusion of skirmish along the bloody beach. The ship is fired and the arms and ammunition go up in a series of explosions. Falling debris imperils men escaping from the burning vessel. The forces of order finally prevail as Israel passes its first serious internal crisis.
The pain and the scars and the rancor left behind by this event would cut deep into the consciousness of Israel, but most historians believe that Israeli sovereignty was born on that day. One of the most important results of this grave incident was that all military forces in Israel, including the Palmach, as well as the Irgun and Lehi, now became united in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. There was something suicidal in the Arab decision to renew the fighting on July the 9th against an Israeli army refreshed and replenished by the truce. Israel responded reluctantly but dynamically. In the next 10 days, Egypt lost over 700 killed, 1,000 wounded, and hundreds of prisoners.
Facing a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Israelis, the Arab states call for an urgent meeting of the Security Council.
It must stop. A vote is taken and the Security Council orders both sides to stop the war in Palestine under pain of economic sanctions and military intervention. There's quick agreement by Prime Minister Ben-Gurion's government of Israel, and the truce is accepted by King Abdullah's Transjordania and the other Arab states.
During the summer of 1948, the United Nations mediator, Count Volker Bernadotte of Sweden, had been formulating a design for what he called a permanent settlement. He met with Arab and Jewish leaders. In his first plan, he proposed to limit Jewish immigration, to award Jerusalem and the Negev to the Arab state, and to make Haifa a free port. The effrontery of this proposal left us breathless. I said in the United Nations that it was like a surgeon who runs away with his patient's vital organs under the pretense of curing him. It would be charitable to believe that the coincidence of these proposals with Britain's strategic interests was a matter of chance. The Israeli decision was to reject Bernadotte's plan. His end was sudden, unexpected, and tragic.
His unrelenting search for a solution ended abruptly and tragically on the afternoon of September 17, 1948. The world was shocked by the news of his assassination in Jerusalem by 3 members of the Jewish terror underground known as the Stern Gang.
United Nations observers were active on all fronts. In the Negev, where Beersheba was still in the hands of the Egyptians, they were at pains to see that no military stores or arms were being illegally transported. At the end of 1948, 11 Jewish settlements in the Negev were still cut off, needing food to survive. When an Israeli relief convoy was attacked, the truce had clearly been broken. The Israeli hold on the Negev was being challenged. Our soldiers responded heavily.
Jewish soldiers are rushed into action to reopen blockaded supply routes to their desert settlements.
The
They headed for the Egyptian base at Beersheba.
Israeli columns rolling in from the north take the ancient stronghold to command a strategic area along their lifelines to the southern desert. Egyptian war material falls to the victorious Israelis. But the defending soldiers brace themselves for counterattack when warplanes of Egypt strike back at the city. Here, small arms fire is used for protection. Again, war takes its toll of dead and wounded. But the Israeli army has gained a signal victory. Egypt's offensive power has been severely crippled, her Palestine bases isolated, and many of her soldiers captured. After a week of warfare, guns are silenced by United Nations action. But after the struggle, Israel's position in the desert land of the Negev is established more firmly than ever before.
Only one Egyptian stronghold, Fallujah, was left there. Besieged in it was a young Egyptian captain, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Beyond Fallujah, our victorious forces now pressed on across the border into Egypt itself. This was too much for the British, who still had a base in Egypt. They issued an ultimatum: withdraw or we shall force you to withdraw. Ben-Gurion agreed, but not before 5 British planes had been shot down by our Air Force. In the north, there remained the Lebanese army and the more threatening Syrians. The Lebanese refused battle, and by the last day in October, the Syrians had been vanquished. Galilee was firmly in Israeli hands. Ben-Gurion had been probing for an Arab-Israeli peace move. On January the 13th, 1949, negotiations for an armistice began on the island of Rhodes, conducted by the new United Nations mediator, Dr. Ralph Bunche. An agreement was reached 6 difficult weeks later.
It was with Egypt setting the example that the others followed. It is doubtful whether any of the other countries, Lebanon, Jordan, or Syria, would have had the political clout or the political courage to enter into armistice negotiations with us, even at the behest of the Security Council, if Egypt had not set the example.
These successful armistice negotiations have demonstrated conclusively the ability of the United Nations to mediate a serious conflict and to avert a dangerous threat to the peace.
With United Nations mediation, the young state of Israel and its Arab neighbors conclude an armistice pact, and the victorious Israeli army stages a well-deserved victory parade.
The war for the destruction of Israel's independence had some inevitable effects upon the condition of those Arabs who chose to remain and become citizens of Israel. On the one hand, they had juridical equality. They could elect members to the Knesset. They could, if they wanted, be represented in our parliament at the precise level of their demographic strength. They were equal before the law. On the other hand, their sympathies went out to their kinsmen across the border. But the fact is, there was a very great level and a very great sector of normality in the relationship between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. The war that the Arabs launched against Israel created 2 parallel refugee problems. On the one hand, there was the Arab refugee problem, created as a result of the flight of the Arabs from the consequences of the war which their leaders had launched. And on the other side, there were 800,000 Jews in the Arab countries who became refugees because the hatred that was directed against them in those countries made it impossible for them to remain. What is different, however, is the way in which the two parties related to their refugee problems. Israel treated the Jewish refugees from Arab countries as citizens, as kinsmen, integrated them into the workforce and into the political system, gave them citizenship as soon as they arrived, and took very strong measures in order to ensure their speedy acceptance into our social and economic framework. The Arabs, on the other hand, regarded the refugees as a political opportunity. They considered, and this prediction was borne out, that if they could keep them in squalor and in misery, in a sense of frustration and desperation, so that their plight would cry out to the conscience of the world, they would thereby alienate Israel from world opinion and create pressure for the entry of those refugees into Israel without peace, that is to say, in conditions in which their entry would create a time bomb.
The issue here is that once you admit that Arab governments launched the war, once you accept the axiom that this refugee problem arose from that war and would not have arisen without it, then you prove by the simplest laws of truth and logic that the Arab governments bear primary responsibility for the creation of this refugee problem. You cannot let loose a war and wash your hands of all responsibility for its tragic consequences.
Those Arabs were there because of right. They are descendants of the very people who lived in Palestine for thousands of years, even before the Jews were there. If some people come from without with a design to occupy their country, to build a state, now where is the responsibility? Whose responsibility is it?
Israel bears no responsibility for a war which it opposed, which it repeatedly yearned to end, and therefore it does not bear the responsibility for the consequences of that war, either for the suffering inflicted by the aggressor in his attack or the defender in his response. We shall do whatever we can earnestly within the limits of our capacity to help alleviate the problem which this aggression has caused.
In the Arab world, the rise of a non-Arab state in the heart of the Middle East was seen as a tragedy and a challenge. Stormy protests erupted all over the Arab world, in Baghdad, in Aleppo in North Syria, and in Aden. The far-flung Arab world was in ferment. In 3 days, 80 Jews were killed in Aden and 4 synagogues were burned. In the old communities of Yemen and Iraq, where Jews had lived long before Muslim and Arab history had begun, the rise of a Jewish state was like the sound of a trumpet, calling them to change the direction of their lives and to join in the construction of a new society. Operation Magic Carpet, as it was called, airlifted thousands of Yemenite Jews to Israel, the last of them in September 1950. The biblical prophecy seemed to be fulfilled. The Lord shall set his hand for the second time to recover the remnants of his people, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcast of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Until 1950, the attempt to emigrate from Iraq to Israel was a capital offense. Many Jews had been killed there. When the law changed, almost all the Jews applied to leave Iraq, an unfortunate 25,000 elected to remain.
A rescue airlift spans the 600 miles from Baghdad to Tel Aviv to bring to safety 54,000 Jews who face a reported reign of terror in Iraq. Planes running 4 to 6 a day have been getting these refugees out at the rate of 10,000 per month. The rescue must be completed by May 31st, the deadline that Iraq has set for Jewish emigration.
For these Sephardim, their arrival in Israel had profound religious meaning, but there was urgent practical demand caused by what had now become a flood of immigrants. At first, the immigrants were settled in villages evacuated by the Arabs in their flight. They made homes out of ruins. When that space was quickly filled, temporary transit camps had to be thrown together, some from old military bases left by the British. On average, nearly 23,000 newcomers were now arriving every month. Even the paperwork presented an administrative challenge. Tents and huts by the thousands were erected, but at times not fast enough to accommodate the flood of immigrants. By the end of 1949, 100,000 people were living in such transit camps. The Ma'abarot were primitive and crowded, flooded by winter rains, exposed to the asperity of the summer heat, and cut off from the main cities and villages. All of Israel's available resources in manpower and material were thrown into the effort to assimilate the new arrivals. The reactions of the new citizens were rewarding. The Ma'abara, or Transition Center, was a unique Israeli experiment designed to encourage immigrants to become independent as soon as they arrived. They were housed in tents or huts, but each family was independent in providing for itself. The government or the Jewish agency provided clinics, dispensaries, schools, unemployment agencies, and the other social services. By the end of 1952, 250,000 new Israelis were living in the Ma'abarot. But the system resulted in enforced idleness, not alleviated by improvised schemes. It retarded the integration of the immigrants. The Ma'abarot were also uneconomic. They placed a strain on Israel's meager financial means. New and better answers had to be found.
And then, after a couple of years, not too many, we started taking people out of these transit camps and putting them in places where hopefully, we hope that in days, months, and years to come, they'll start to be productive. So all in all, in the whole country, we built about 500 villages for newcomers, and during the years, about 25 new towns.
Another development was the creation of extensive new housing projects next to the Ma'abarot. People were thus able to move from the makeshift arrangements of the transit camps into brand new accommodations where they could forge a community. As 1949 began, every available surface was plastered with election propaganda. In January, the people of Israel went to the polls for the first time to elect a government to replace the one that had brought them from the birth of the state to the end of a victorious war. Ben-Gurion's Mapai party, the group of moderate socialists affiliated with Labour, won 46 of the 120 members of the Knesset. It was by far the biggest party in a fragmented parliament. One of the Knesset's first acts was the election of a president. Inevitably, the choice fell upon Dr. Chaim Weizmann. although the immigrants would eventually become Israel's main economic resource, for the time being, they were Israel's major economic problem. The number of consumers had grown spectacularly. The number of producers had diminished. By the middle of 1949, Israel's fragile economy was nearing collapse. It was necessary to impose strict austerity on the country. The rations were meager, 1 egg per person per week at first, later 1 per month. There was a tremendous hunger for protein. A vigorous black market sprang to life, and the currency began to lose its value. Smuggled dollars brought a premium rate of exchange. It was not good Zionism, but the dealers prospered. Chickens, dead or alive, became desirable out of all proportion to their appearance. Suddenly it became necessary and possible to assume the appurtenances of the state. It was urgent to have an Israeli postal service, Israeli currency and banks, an Israeli airline, a tourist industry, and all the infrastructure and trappings of a modern state, all with a proud stamp of Israeli ownership and sovereignty. Another proud attribute of statehood was the exchange of ambassadors with other sovereign countries. We were honored by the arrival of plenipotentiaries from the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and other nations. Our first ambassador to the Soviet Union was no less a figure than Golda Meir. Our diplomatic representative in Poland, Yisrael Barzilai, was arriving on the scene of the most appalling suffering the Jews had experienced during the war. When the first British ambassador presented himself to our Knesset speaker in President Weizmann's absence through illness, the victory of Zionism over Ernest Bevin was complete. On March the 24th, I secured the decision of the Security Council by 9-1 in favor of Israel's admission to the United Nations. Even that decision had to be fought through in committee and in the Assembly.
The admission of the applicant, if taken, would be the highest consummation of injustice, and it will draw another nail into the coffin of the United Nations.
Israel is the only one of the 160 members that has had to get up and plead for its membership. Normally, you send a letter and you say you want to be a member. But I had to make speeches for 9 hours and a kind of a cross-examination, like in the police court, about why we presume to think that we can be members. There's been nothing like that in the history of any other people.
We look forward to Israel representing and upholding those traditions of freedom and democratic progress.
In the case of the applicant, such evidence is altogether lacking.
The New Zealand delegation will, of course, vote for the admission of Israel.
After a vote of 37-12 for admission, with 9 nations abstaining, Assembly President Herbert B. Ebat announced,
And I therefore formally declare Israel admitted to membership in the United Nations.
As the other members cheered, delegates of the Arab states who bitterly opposed Israel walked out. These are Lebanon, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq.
Early in 1947, when I was a young, rather obscure and completely anonymous Zionist official, somebody had said to me that 1 year from then, you, Abba Eban, will be leading a Jewish delegation in the Security Council, the highest organ of international security, and pleading successfully for a ceasefire, for an end of the war, and above all for the recognition by the world of Israel as a legitimate sovereign state. Well, I just said that's a crazy fantasy. I shall still always retain the feeling in my hands of the rope with which I put our flag on the mast, knowing that in that very moment when the flag went to the top, the status of the Jewish people in history had irreversibly changed. In America, our most powerful friend, President Truman, was running for re-election. He was not expected to win.
And then it happened. The man from Missouri awoke from a refreshing sleep to learn that he'd been returned to the White House by a mandate of the people.
I felt that we were rather the conscience of the free world. And that's the reason why I so promptly recognized the new state of Israel.
I take the first opportunity coming on these, stepping on the ground of this great capital to express my heartfelt thanks to the President of the United States and to the government of this country for all they've done in making out of Israel a reality.
We took comfort from the militant and efficient way in which American Jewry was organizing itself under the somber but dynamic leadership of Abba Hillel Silver. Our supporters were not afraid to take to the streets or to the largest auditorium.
Salute to Israel, American Zionist leader Dr. Abba Hillel Silver.
And behind that front line are the vast spiritual and physical reserves and resources of world Jewry, which has resolved that it is tired of being stepped upon and will not permit itself to be stepped upon any longer.
I was 33 when I became the leader of our effort in the United Nations and of our embassy in Washington. In September 1950, I presented my credentials to President Truman. Ben-Gurion and Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet wished me to develop a tradition under which an Israeli ambassador would carry weight in America and in the world, and not only in official Washington. One of my early duties as ambassador was to arrange for Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to make his first visit to the United States.
War of independence, fought after 6 millions of our people have been exterminated by the Nazis, proved once again that the cause of justice, faithfully pursued, must triumph in the end.
Next stop for the Israeli premier is New York City. In a parade through its towering canyons, the leader of one of the world's newest republics is hailed by 1 million people.
Visiting the White House, Ben-Gurion presented President Truman with a symbol of the state that he had helped into existence. From September 1950, I was ambassador to the United States as well as to the United Nations. My first aim was to create a legal and political basis for American-Israeli cooperation and alliance. In 1951, Dean Acheson and I negotiated the eligibility of Israel for American aid and signed the first agreements of friendship and commerce.
James G. McDonnell, first U.S. ambassador to Israel, with former Miss America Bess Meyerson at left and Shoshana Damari, Israeli folk singer, campaign in behalf of Israel's $500 million independence bond issue.
There's a general impression that Israel is busy with only 2 things, politics and austerity. But when you get to Israel, you'll find that not politics or austerity, but production, building, new settlements, a tremendous spirit of achievement and progress dominates the whole country.
The whole of Jewish history is an eternal celebration of resilience. This quality has rarely come to finer expression than in the manner in which Israel now created its own opportunities. We inherited an economy almost exclusively dependent on agriculture. It was imperative to exploit such natural resources as we had and to build an industrial base. We needed manufacturing plants. Above all, we needed irrigation, and so much effort and ingenuity was spent in utilizing our meager supply of water. A pipeline to the Negev caused the desert to bloom. Israel even entered the textile and automobile industries. In December 1949, the United Nations decided, though without much conviction, that it would try to establish an international authority over Jerusalem. Having turned its back on Jerusalem when the city faced famine and destruction in 1948, the United Nations belatedly claimed jurisdiction. The only effect was to bring about a resolute Israeli reaction. Ben-Gurion moved to the Knesset from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, where it took an oath never to leave that city again. The central problem in the relations between Israel and the Arab world has been the persistent attempt of Arab governments to deny our legitimacy as a state. We had nourished a hope that Arab-Jewish coexistence would find its first expression in a settlement with Jordan. There was nothing of the inhuman virulence which marked the attitude of the other Arab nations toward Israel's existence. The embodiment of this hope was, of course, King Abdullah. Abdullah's ambitions had attracted the enmity of his fellow Arabs, especially the Egyptians.
King Abdullah, who was 69, was shot as he was going to pray at a mosque close to that famous shrine, the Mosque of Omar.
In Egypt, the corrupt and profligate government of King Farouk was overthrown by a military coup. A bloodless revolution brought Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser into power. King Farouk sailed to Italy for a few more years of a good life.
It is my earnest conviction that peace can and will be achieved in Palestine at an early date.
All attempts to reach a lasting peace with the Arabs failed. They organized a boycott of Israeli goods and markets and put pressure on their own trading partners to withdraw their recognition of Israel. We had evidence that their military staffs were preparing for the next war. I felt that we must create a bipartisan American-Israeli tradition. I arranged an early meeting between Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet and President Eisenhower in Washington. The change in the leadership of the United States was a watershed for Israel. In May 1952, I spoke at a dinner honoring President Truman. I said, "We do not have orders or decorations. Our material strength is small and greatly strained. We have no tradition of formality or chivalry. One thing, however, is within the power of Israel to confer. It is the gift of immortality. Those whose names are bound up with Israel's history never become forgotten. We are therefore now writing the name of President Truman on the map of our country."
I'm very touched and grateful, and a little bit overwhelmed. They have a village name for me, but when they're talking about a statue, want me to join George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Chaim Weizmann, I have about to come to the conclusion that I'm not ready yet to go into a piece of marble.
For the first 5 years, from 1948 to 1952, nothing had seemed to go wrong. Then there followed 3 nightmare years in which almost nothing seemed to go right. In November 1952, the first president, Chaim Weizmann, died.
To the town of Rehovot, Israel, came the mourners, Arabs as well as Jews. 250,000 to pass the catafalque on which the body of Chaim Weizmann lay in state.
Without Truman and Weizmann, the scene was unfamiliar. More unexpectedly, Ben-Gurion resigned in 1953. Ben-Gurion was a buoyant, vigorous, pugnacious, defiant man who sent out sparks of energy in all directions. For over 2 decades, he had carried heavy burdens. When Ben-Gurion resigned the premiership, he made it clear that he was leaving office, but he was not leaving power. Nothing in him was exactly what it seemed. Israel would face a different future with new figures in the center of the drama.